Sarah Churchill was, by all accounts, a horrible person. Her ruthless ambition and cold heart made her one of the most powerful women in Europe, but she saved her absolute worst for her so-called best friend, Queen Anne of Great Britain, and the things she did to her were utterly brutal. We'll get more into that later. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, was born Sarah Jennings in 1660 to Richard Jennings and Frances Thornhurst. As the daughter of a parliamentarian with a good name, she was comfortably upper middle class and rubbed shoulders with royalty. But she wanted more, so much more. So she started rubbing the right shoulders. She saw her humbler beginnings as an opportunity. She found work as the maid of honor to Mary of Modena, the stepmother of the young Princess Anne. Sarah, who was 13 at the time, was 5 years older than Anne, but the two of them quickly became close friends. By this point, Sarah was already set on climbing the social ladder, and for a young woman in the 17th century, the only way to do that was through a man. Luckily, when she was just 15 years old, she caught the eye of John Churchill. He was 10 years older than Sarah, but fell madly in love with her. You see, Sarah and Churchill had found the perfect social climbing match in each other, but the fiendish greed that they had brought out in each other frightened their families. Both of their families refused to support the match, so the couple got married in secret and began plotting their ruthless rise to the top. Sarah's close friendship with Princess Anne was her source of power and influence at court, but hitching her wagon to the princess was just as risky as it was rewarding. In 1688, both women found themselves in terrible danger. Princess Anne's own father, King James II, placed Sarah and Anne under house arrest on suspicion of treason. Sarah knew she was in big trouble. She knew that the king wouldn't behead his very own daughter, but she was a lot less certain about what he would do to her. So she convinced Anne that their only hope of survival was to escape. The two of them easily slipped away from the palace and waited for the political winds to change. And boy, did they ever. Sarah and Princess Anne survived the king's reign, but Anne's sister Mary rose to power next. And that's where the jealousy started. By that time, everyone knew that Sarah exerted total control over Anne, and the royal court grew weary of her power. Mary demanded that Anne dismiss Sarah, but Anne refused. Sarah's hooks were already too deep into her side. Sarah put all of her eggs in the Anne basket, and her gamble was about to pay off. Big time. In 1702, Anne finally ascended to the throne, and it was time for Sarah to cash in. Using her dark influence, she managed to secure a sizable income for her and her husband, and became the keeper of the privy purse. In other words, she had access to all of Anne's money. All of it. At this point, it seemed like Sarah had gotten everything that she wanted, but this is where things really started to go wrong. Despite being the best of friends, Sarah had never really been Anne's social equal. And this presented a lot of problems. Regardless of everything, Anne had always wanted a genuine friend. Sarah had always spoken plainly and openly to her, maybe even insolently. But once she became Queen Anne, there was an entire kingdom that separated them in rank. And, well, Sarah just couldn't tolerate that. Things were about to get messy. Eventually, everyone could see that her friendship with Anne was paying off in spades. The Queen kept giving her fancy new appointments and lavishing titles and honors on her husband, John Churchill. But there was one gift in particular that was almost too generous, even by royal standards. Anne gave Sarah and Churchill a palace. The massive Blenheim Palace. Now Sarah and Anne were truly equal in all but title. And surprise, surprise, Sarah's head got a little too big. Her blunt honesty had always been something that Anne appreciated, but it quickly turned to outright disrespect, which got to a point that not even Anne could tolerate. Little by little, Sarah started to overstep her position and overpower the Queen in her own court. Her strong personality was okay with Anne when it worked in her favor, but the realities of palace politics were about to get between good friends. Sarah's political maneuvering at court started to irritate her best friend, the Queen, because the two had radically opposing political views. Sarah was pushing for more progressive reforms that Anne considered against the interests of the crown, which, was resting on top of her head. It was only a matter of time before Sarah finally went too far. Her open defiance of the Queen in matters pertaining to Parliament was becoming intolerable, but the relatively weak-willed Anne was essentially powerless to do anything about her domineering friend. Sarah started to spend even more time away from court, overlooking the construction of Blenheim Palace, but she forgot just how she had risen so high in the first place, by sticking close to Anne. And little did she know that while she was away, the Queen was already finding her replacement. Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin, was cozying up to Anne and pushing Sarah out of the picture. Around this time, things were really starting to fall apart for Sarah. Though she had a loving marriage to Churchill, their fortunes weren't always so great. Sarah lost her last surviving son to smallpox in 1703, and no amount of royal favor was going to bring him back to life. In her grief, she lashed out at Anne by refusing to respond to her letters, or even worse, responding with chilling brevity. Clearly, she did not know how to process grief. When she finally returned to court, she continued her open defiance of the Queen, and carrying on like the world's worst best friend. When Anne's husband passed, the whole court went into mourning. Except Sarah. She was incredibly rude. In fact, she declined to wear mourning clothes at all. It was a clear sign that she disdained the Queen's grief. Anne felt like Sarah had betrayed her by abandoning the court to work on Blenheim Palace. But having her back at court was no walk in the park either. The two continued fighting like cats and dogs, and over trivial things too. On the way to a Thanksgiving service, they had an argument over the jewels that Anne was wearing. It quickly turned ugly. The carriage ride to the church service was definitely tense, but the Mass itself turned their fight from a small spat into an all-out feud. Once inside the church, Anne tried to continue the argument, but Sarah, using way too much sass when speaking to a queen, lashed out and snapped, "Be quiet." Now, Queen Anne could put up with a lot, but her best friend was really starting to push it. She was skating on thin ice, and embarrassing the Queen in public was the straw that broke the camel's back. From this point on, Anne decided that she wasn't going to let Sarah run roughshod over her anymore. For once, Sarah had to apologize for her rudeness, but it was too little, too late. She might have thought twice about mouthing off to the Queen if she had any idea just how frosty their friendship had become, and just how replaceable she actually was. Behind her back, Anne had provided her new friend Abigail with the dowry for her secret wedding. Of course, as far as Sarah was concerned, the Queen's money was her money, so she did not take the news well at all. She definitely felt jealous of Abigail's growing influence with Anne. After all, she knew just how profitable it could be to be in the Queen's favor. Sarah started desperately pushing her political agenda on Anne, all in an attempt to reassert her position. But Anne wasn't having any of it this time. She continued showering Abigail with the kind of favors that Sarah had once received. and eventually it became obvious to everyone what was really happening. Decades earlier, courtiers had tried to force Queen Anne to get rid of Sarah because of her growing influence. Now it was Sarah's turn to try to force Abigail out. She went to Parliament and tried to force Anne to get rid of her new companion. Of course, by now she had learned a lot about court politics. This time, to get her way, she was prepared to play dirty. She actually managed to whip up a lot of support in Parliament to have Abigail dismissed. But for once, Anne wasn't going to let her bossy best friend tell her what she could and couldn't do. She was going to be the stubborn one. Anne refused Sarah's demands and kept Abigail close by. And now it was crystal clear that Sarah had bitten the hand that fed her. She and her husband Churchill had been something of a power couple for decades. John kept winning battles in Spain, and Sarah kept spinning his victories into political power and buckets of money. But her latest games in court had been a step too far for Anne. The Queen fired John on trumped-up charges of embezzlement. For the first time ever, it was Sarah who was on the outside, and it was only going to get worse. Her final meeting with Anne was a chilly affair. She pleaded to know why their friendship had deteriorated into an all-out feud. Anne refused to answer her and only repeated the rehearsed lines. "I shall make no answer to anything you say, and you may put it in writing." Sarah was so distraught in her meeting that she immediately broke out in tears. She called Anne's coolness inhuman and proceeded to threaten the Queen, saying that God would seek vengeance for how she had been treated. That one hit a nerve with the religious Queen. Feeling extremely insulted, Anne dismissed Sarah and her husband from all of their court appointments and stopped funding Sarah's pet project, the palace. She and her husband had to leave England in disgrace. Of course, it was no secret that the two women had fallen out. The whole of Europe was waiting to see if these friends would kiss and make nice. Near the end of her life, one eyewitness claimed to have heard Queen Anne ask a telling question. Apparently, she asked whether or not the Marlboroughs had come ashore yet, perhaps even insinuating that she had invited them back herself. Well, if she'd heard what Sarah Churchill would do to her after she was gone, she probably would have changed her tune. Sarah ended up returning to England on the very same afternoon that Anne passed away, and the new king immediately welcomed the Marlboroughs back to court. Sarah continued influencing court life, but her real occupation was overseeing the construction of Blenheim Palace. Of course, now that Anne was gone, she had to fund the construction of her new home out of her own purse, and while she spent the Queen's money freely, Sarah was a penny pincher when it came to her own coin. She hired cheaper workers and was a constant thorn in the side of the primary architect. Based on what we've heard about her, we probably could have guessed that part. After Queen Anne passed, Sarah took the time to thoroughly drag her in her memoirs. She essentially called Anne an idiot of a queen who would never have gotten anywhere without her. And I'm not just talking about some stern words here. She really went for it when it came time to drag Anne's name through the mud. She wrote, "Nobody can maintain that Anne was wise, nor entertaining in conversation. She was ignorant in everything, but what the parsons had taught her when she was a child, being very ignorant, very fearful, with very little judgment." Talk about brutal. And that wasn't even the worst thing that she ever did to the Queen. When Sarah tried to get Parliament to force Anne to fire Abigail, she knew asking nicely wouldn't be enough. Oh no, she had to give them a reason. Sarah went so far as to accuse Anne of carrying on a romantic affair with Abigail. Now, that was the kind of allegation that Parliament might listen to. It didn't work, but you can't say that she wasn't willing to play dirty. So it's no wonder she had such a horrible reputation. How do you feel about Sarah Churchill's actions? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next video.